Webster defines crunch time as a critical moment or period, like the end of a game, when decisive action is needed. Every sports fan knows this time in the game. Your palms sweat just a little more, your heart races just a little bit faster, and you live and die with every play until the final seconds tick off the clock and you're either celebrating a victory or disappointed by the defeat. The team at Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network understands just how critical these moments are. For us, it begins as soon as the next set of games are on the board. We evaluate the opening lines and any breaking news throughout the week. We cover each game inside and out, whether it's from inside the locker room to a huddle down on the field, the court, or the ice. We take you inside the meeting room with scouts, coaches, and executives. We have our fingers on the pulse of all the sports that we cover: the National Hockey League, NBA, college basketball, college football, and the National Football League. We are the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, and we're here to help you find your sports advantage. After all the data has been crunched, we then turn it over to Kenneth for the best analysis around. His unique perspective in both understanding the data and how it applies to the game and how you win is the Crunch Time Sports Advantage. Are you ready? The Crunch Time Jet is fueled and ready for takeoff, and the Crunch Time Express is about to leave the station. Your VIP pass has been approved, so all aboard.
Welcome to the 2024 College Football Team Autopsy Report. An autopsy report is a document that summarizes the findings of an autopsy, an examination of a body after death. It includes details of the examination, tests, and observations performed, as well as the cause and manner of death. Just like a real autopsy report, the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network College Football Autopsy Report examines a team's body of work after the season has concluded. This report includes a review of the team's season win total and whether they met expectations, key offensive, defensive, and special teams metrics that shaped the season, a deep dive into coaching decisions, including situational play and fourth down aggressiveness, a final season grade, evaluating execution, performance in key moments, and consistency, the final verdict, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what must be fixed for 2025. With the 2024 season in the rearview mirror, it's time to examine the patient. To present the findings, we have called in our Chief Medical Examiner and Senior Analyst, Kenneth.
And welcome in, everyone, to the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network 2024 Team Autopsy Report. We got the Florida State Seminoles on the autopsy table because this patient is in desperate need of an autopsy. Let's just jump right in. We're going to start with the head coach, Mike Norvell, because what we're seeing out of Mike Norvell either is a real unfortunate bad season or a really bad trend that's about to start. So let's take a look at Mike Norvell's overall record. Now, during his 4 years at Memphis, coach was 38-16. A 700 win percentage. That's what got him the job. Let's take a look at his tenure at Florida State. In his 5 years there, 33 wins, 27 losses, 550 win percentage, significant drop down. Now, let's break down his record even further. First 2 years, you're kind of trying to build that program up. A total of 8 wins his first 2 years. The next 2 were absolutely spectacular. 23 wins in those 2 years, 13-1 back in 2023. Last year, 2-10. This year is the most important year in Mike Norvell's coaching career because I'm going to go ahead and say it. If Mike Norvell does not find a way to get this team in the hunt for the ACC title, it could be his final season there in Tallahassee. So let's take a look at where his team stood last year. We're going to always start right there with the betting number. Folks, this team's season win total was 9.5. you want to talk about cashing that ticket early. You basically, if you had a under on the season win total of the Florida State Seminoles last year, you cashed that before we changed the calendar to October. That's how bad of a start this team got off to. And it wasn't because of key injuries. This team got out of the gate and was absolutely punished from the very first kickoff there in Dublin. All right, let's take a look at our projections. We have our composite win total. This is our breakdown during the season. 3 key factors go into that number. Folks, we had the Seminoles as a 2.3, so our data points throughout the season said that this was one of the worst teams in college football, bar none. Now, let's talk about your strength of record and your strength of schedule. Now, your strength of schedule, you can more so control as far as an out-of-conference standpoint. In conference, it's kind of a mixed bag, but we give you a little bit more control on your strength of schedule. The Seminoles had a strength of schedule of 0.562, the 13th most difficult schedule in all of college football. Now, your strength of record, basically, we kind of look at that as like your opponent's winning percentage. What does your opponents do throughout their season? This team had a strength of record of 705, the number one strength of record schedule in all of college football, meaning you're going to hear some of their opponents' win-loss records here, and they're going to be absolutely amazing how well their opponents did throughout the 2024 season. So let's go ahead and jump into that, if you will. We're going to look at your offense, your defense, your head coach, your special teams. We're going to look at how you performed in the games that you won and lost from both an offensive and defensive standpoint. So before I get into that, let's take a look at how good were these defenses that the Florida State Seminoles team went up against. Folks, here's the records. That opener in Dublin, as I mentioned, Georgia Tech finished with a 7-5 record. Same can be said for Boston College. The Memphis Tigers, 10-2. Even the Cal Golden Bears had a 6-6 record in the regular season. SMU, 11-1, made the college football playoffs. Clemson, 9-3, won the ACC, also made the playoffs. Duke, 9-3. Miami, 10-2. North Carolina, 6-6. Notre Dame, 11-1. And the Florida Gators, 7-5. This team did not play a team with a losing record all year long. Now, that's good if you were winning some of those games, but when we look at the teams that they beat, only Cal and an FCS team in Charleston Southern are the only 2 wins that the Noles got last year. So as I mentioned, we're going to look at your opponent's defensive power rankings. We used to benchmark of 68 because that's how many Power 4 teams there are when you add the 4 major conferences and include Notre Dame. Want to see how many of those defenses were inside of that top 68. And you can imagine with the win-loss record that I just gave you, a lot of those teams are going to find themselves inside of that top 68 from a defensive standpoint. Georgia Tech was 15th. Boston College was 55th. And if you're listening on the podcast, thank you for joining us. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see those numbers on your screen here. The Cal Golden Bears were 46th in defense. SMU was 34th. Clemson was 35th. Duke was 45th. Miami was 47th. Notre Dame was 9th. And the Florida Gators were 17th. 9 of those opponents were inside of that top 68. If you kind of average out their opponents' defensive power rankings, 43rd is what they would have faced. So you're talking about week in and week out facing a really good defensive team somewhere in the middle of the pack as far as the Power 5 goes. I'm sorry, Power 4 goes. Okay, now let's jump over to the offense. And if I had to sum up this offense in a bullet point, I would say the key takeaway is this team massively underperformed in 2024, finishing with an abysmal 2-10 record. The Seminoles faced a strong strength of record, the toughest strength of record in the country, but most of their offensive woes and turnover struggles prevented them from competing in most games. Folks, this offense was not only ineffective, it was also inefficient. Here's the breakdown. Average team last year in college football at the Division I level averaged about 28 points. The Florida State Seminoles averaged 15.4, and when we adjust for opponents, it's right around that same number, 15.7. So just a hair tick better than the average. Average team passing yards per game, about 227 yards per game. The Noles were at 180. But when we adjust for opponent, it actually goes down to 165. So a regression there of 15 yards per game. The average NCAA team last year rushed for about 160 yards. I want you to listen to what the Noles averaged last year, 89.9. So basically 90 yards per game. Now, when we adjust for opponent, goes up about 27, 28 yards to about 118, but still way short of what the average team it was able to rush for last year. We talked about how bad the quarterback play was. Folks, this offensive line play and running backs there in Tallahassee, one of the worst in college football. Average team total offense, 387 yards per game. The Noles were almost over 100 yards off of that. 270 yards per game in total offense. When we adjust for opponent, we do have them sitting at 283 yards per game, still 100 yards below what the average team got on offense last year. Now, let's move on to some of our key data points here. How many drives did you have last year that ended with either a touchdown or field goal? Average team last year was about 40%. The Noles were at 30.8. That is significantly way off the average. Same can be said with their drives ending with a touchdown. Average team is about 28% of their drives ending with the touchdowns. The Noles were at 19%. And as far as third down conversions, average team last year was about 39%. Florida State was at 30.5. This team could not protect the quarterback, regardless of whether it was DJ, whether it was Brock Glenn or Luke. Neither one of those quarterbacks were being protected. 45 sacks given up by the Noles last year, committed 22 turnovers. That's how you lose 10 games last year. And we talked about 134 teams in Division I football. We talk about our 3 E's, how effective, how efficient, and how explosive your offense was last year. I want you to take a look at where Florida State was last year. 131st in both explosiveness and effectiveness. 121st in efficiency. The Florida State Seminoles, out of 134 offenses last year, was our 128th offense in college football. No strengths last year. Poor passing attack, non-existent running game, and offensive line was atrocious, is basically the summary of this offense. Let's flip it over to the defense and see if we can find any words of encouragement there. Now, once again, how good were the offenses that Florida State's defense went against last year? Still using that same bench line of 68. Georgia Tech was 61st. Boston College was 54th. Memphis, 47th best offense in college football last year. SMU was 10th. Clemson was 13th. Duke was 59th. Miami had the number 1 power ranked offense for us last year. North Carolina was 40th. Notre Dame was 4th. And the Florida Gators ended the year as our 25th best offense in college football. 10 of their opponents were inside of the top 68. And if you add in Cal, all of their opponents were inside of the top 80. Folks, they were facing some high, potent offenses last year. Average their offensive power rankings, 35th. Now you're talking about an offense that basically would have been a top 35 in college football every single week. Florida State's defense, decent, but looked overworked. A lot of that has to do with the offensive inefficiency. So let's take a look at the breakdowns for the Noles on the defensive side of the ball. Now, their defense averaged giving up 28 points per game. When we adjust that for opponent, actually goes down about 5.5 points to 22.5. Their passing yards per game allowed 201 yards per game. When we adjust that for opponent, actually see that number go down to about 158 yards per game, almost a 44-yard improvement there. As far as their rush defense, this defense gave up 185 yards per game on the ground. When we adjust for opponent, slight regression there to about 197 yards per game. I think that has a lot to do with them being on the field way too much last year. Total offense allowed 386 yards per game. When we adjust for opponent, about a 32-yard per game improvement down to 354 yards per game. This team did a really good job of getting after the quarterback. Average team last year had about 23.5 sacks per game. The Noles had about 28, it looks like. We're looking at the opponent's drives ending with a score, either a touchdown or field goal. As I mentioned, 44% is what the Noles defense surrendered last year. Did a good job of keeping their opponents out of the end zone, though. Only 26% of their opponent's drives ended with a touchdown. That's below the 28%, which was the average last year. Now, third down conversion, this team struggled. Their opponents converted about 42.6% on third downs. Their opponents also found a lot of success going for it on fourth down. 11 out of 16. About 60, let's call it 69%, and this team could not force turnovers. Only 6 forced turnovers in those games. Let's take a look at the special teams. Because the special teams was the one bright spot on this team last year. Made all of their extra points, missed one field goal, 12 out of 13, 92% there from the field goal kicking standpoint. This team also was the number one average per punt team in college football last year, 48.6 yards per punt. That is flipping the field. Would have been nice if the offense would have gave this unit some better help there. As far as the penalties, nothing noticeable there. So let's get to the coaching here. In one game situations last year, the Noles were 1-3 versus quality opponents, 0-6. Fourth down rank, how aggressive was Mike Norvell going for it on fourth down? He was the 17th out of 144 qualifying Division I coaches last year of going for it. Attempted 32 fourth down attempts last year, converted 17. Went for it 32 times, converted 20 of those. 60, looks like about 62.5%. So found some success there on fourth down, but their defense was absolutely a leaking oil can as far as fourth down. So let's talk about what went wrong for the Noles really quickly before we get into the offense and defensive breakdowns as far as wins and losses. This offense was non-existent last year. We talked about it. An overall offensive ranking of 128. Folks, you're not going to win many games like that. Turnovers kill drives. This team looks like was a -18 in the turnover differential there. You're certainly not going to win a lot of games like there. And the defense struggled at times, but I think that had a lot to do with how bad the offense performed. So let's get into the breakdown here. In the games that they won, and there were only 2 of them, so you're going to see this offense averaged about 27 points per game. Let's call it almost 28 points per game. Was throwing the ball for about 208 yards per game on just 25 attempts, 8.3 yards per attempt, 13 yards per completion. This team was running the ball quite effectively, about 38 rushing attempts per game, 141 yards, 3.8 yards per rushing attempt. not a good rush attempt there. So they were more of a volume running team. Let's take a look. Their third down conversions, they were 41% on third downs in those wins, only committed one turnover, folks, in the 10 games that they lost, averaging just 13 points per game. The passing yards dipped down to 175 yards per game, and that's on almost 6 more passing attempts per game, 5.7 yards per passing attempt. Let's call it 12 yards per completion. The rushing attempts also dipped down, about 7 less rushing attempts. Rushing yards were cut in half, about 80 yards per game, rushing 2.6 yards per rushing attempt. Folks, this team on third downs was converting about 25% on third downs. And here's the biggest bugaboo that you're going to find: 21 turnovers in those 10 losses. So in those losses, they were averaging about 2 touchdowns per game less, averaging about 30, let's call it 34 fewer passing yards and about 61 fewer rushing yards. So almost 100 yards per game in total offense was missing in those losses. Let's take a look at the defensive numbers here. In those 2 wins against inferior opponents, allowing 8 points per game, let's call it 261 yards per game, passing on 35 attempts, 7.6 yards per passing attempt, 11.8 yards per completion. Their opponents were running the ball about 82 yards per game on 33 attempts, 2.5 yards per rushing attempt, allowing just 33% conversion rate on third downs by their opponents, and forced 3 turnovers in those 2 wins. In their 10 losses, allowing 32 points per game, let's call it 189 yards per game passing on 26 passing attempts, 7.4 yards per attempt, 11.8 again yards per completion. So the pass defense was actually respectable. In those losses, though, 41 rushing attempts, 205 yards per game, rushing allowed 5.5 yards per rushing attempt. Opponents were converting on third down at about 46.5%. And this team in 10 losses only forced 3 turnovers. So when they lost, they were giving up 3 additional touchdowns and a field goal per game. And looks like they were giving up about 120 more rushing yards per game. So this team absolutely struggled majorly. I want to talk about the quarterbacks here before we get to the final verdict and hand out the Seminoles final grade here. DJ appeared in 5 games, completed 54%, 4 touchdowns, 6 INTs. His backup, Brock Glenn, 7 games, completed 45% passing, 4 touchdowns, 5 INTs. Luke Cromacher, 6 games, 52% completion percentage, 3 touchdowns, 2 INTs. Regardless of who the quarterback was, this team could not get any production from the passing game. Here's maybe the most shocking stat that I saw from the Seminoles last year. They did not have a single running back go for 500 yards rushing last year. That is unheard of for the Florida State Seminoles. You want to take it a step further? Their best running back, Lawrence Tofila, had 109 carries in 12 games, 456 yards, and had 3 total rushing touchdowns. He averaged 38 yards rushing per game. Just pathetic. And then when we flip it over to the passing game, not one Florida State Seminole wide receiver had 35 receptions during the season. No Florida State Seminole wide receiver had even 600 yards receiving for the season. Ja'Kyrie Douglas, 32 receptions, 519 yards, 4 total receiving touchdowns. He averaged 43 yards receiving per game, and he was their leading wide receiver. Never seen anything like that from a Florida State team in all the years I've been watching them. The one bright spot on defense was Patrick Payton in 12 games, led the team with 11 tackles for loss, did have 4 sacks. But this team did not have a standout defensive player either. I'm looking at their leaders as far as the leader in interceptions. No Florida State player had more than 1 interception. They only had 4 total interceptions on the game, on the season. Folks, what happened to Florida State? I don't want to hear the excuse of them being left out of the playoffs a year ago led to this kind of debacle. This is a lack of leadership, both at the head coaching spot and as far as the captains on the field. Major disappointment all the way around for the Florida State Seminoles. So let's get to the final verdict and hand out the final grade. Folks, you can't be shocked about the final grade that we give the 2024 Florida State Seminoles. They get our first F of the year. Why? Well, it's quite obvious. Horrible offense, horrible defense, and bad coaching. The final verdict: Florida State endured a disastrous 2024 season, failed to meet any of their expectations. Yes, they played a strong strength of record, but that has nothing to do with their offense being simply inept to keep up, and the defense was overworked, making matters worse. So let's spend the last remaining minutes here of the podcast and talk about what does this team need to do in 2025 to get back to respectability. We got 3 keys for you. And the first one starts with the offensive line. The Florida State Seminoles need to revamp that entire offensive line and reduce the number of sacks. Now, marry that up with this team also getting better quarterback play and better play calling. Got to put an extra tight end into block. Make sure whoever the starting quarterback in 2025 is better protected than what we saw last year. 45 sacks is just absolutely unallowable for a program like Florida State. Key number 2, they must establish a functional running game to take the pressure off of the passing attack. Go find you a running back, either coming out of high school or the transfer portal. Folks, you're in the state of Florida. You ought to have access to some of the best premier talent in all of America. There's no excuse for having a running back not rush for 500 yards there in Tallahassee. Get that shored up. That's going to take some pressure off of your quarterback. And then third, improve the turnover discipline. Regardless of who the quarterback was, they were turning it over multiple times per game. Got to improve that turnover differential there, being one of the worst in the nation last year. If the Seminoles can improve in these 3 areas, the Florida State Seminoles should find their way back to bowl eligibility in 2025.
Thank you for tuning into this podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and our deep dive into all things college football. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You can follow us on Twitter at CrunchTimeVIP for updates, insights, and more content. And make sure to visit our website at crunchtimesportsadvantage.com for in-depth blogs, game previews, and information about our Crunch Time Express handicapping packages. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for our next patient on the 2024 College Football Autopsy Report.